I have great respect for Mike as a commanding officer. I mean, he was a lieutenant or a lieutenant commander. I can't remember what, but he was in his outfit. He was the chief dog down on the Vinte Canal, which was probably 40 miles from the Mekong River and 40 miles from the Gulf of Thailand, about halfway between, was our base. The senior naval officer there was Conley. So I would go down, I might be the senior officer for 8 or 10 PBRs because of my rank. I was a lieutenant JG, but more of a senior JG. But Mike was a rank ahead of me, so he became the commander of both the rag boats and the PBRs in terms of where we went at night, what we did, get together at noon, or when we came back into the Vinte during the daytime to get more ammo and fuel and water and so forth. And Mike would get us together at the command boat, which was one of these rag boats, which had lots of antennas on it and radios and stuff. But I got to know Mike just because he was my commanding officer when I was down on the canal. I had great respect for him. He would sit there and slug it out, and he would get on the radio and try and orient boats if there was a firefight. Had great respect, I think, from all the guys that were in these rag boats that worked directly for him, and those of us who worked for him operationally when we were together.
I wonder if if you think about maybe if you were addressing a class of ensigns and you were asked to speak about an officer you respected when you were in the Navy, and you're going to speak about Mike Connolly, and sort of what would you tell the ensigns were the characteristics of this officer that you admired, that you respected when you were in the Mekong?
Well, I would say that um, as an officer like Mike was, what makes him effective is he has to have a connection with his troops. They have to believe him, and they'll realize that he'll do whatever he's asking them to do. I mean, he's not a sit back in an armchair type of person. And you lead by example, and you don't expose people unnecessarily to harm, but when you have to fight, you fight, and you all work together as a unit. And if one guy goes down, the next guy takes over, and it's seamless, it's automatic. And so Mike was, I guess, if I was telling ensigns, I'd say, if you want to be successful in the Navy, you got to be a sailor's officer. In other words, you got to see life from their angle.
Hmm.
And he was that type of person. Bob Olsen was a loner. He was a guy who had been an advisor in Vietnam to the Vietnamese. This was his second tour. He was back. Like, maybe it was his third tour. I can't remember. But he had been in Vietnam a lot. He liked working by himself, and he would lead by example. He would take Vietnamese out on ambushes and do things that he was good at. But he especially uh, liked working by himself. I mean, and I guess if you're a ranger or if you work for the OSS, maybe in World War II, this sort of singularity approach to warfare, it can work in a guerrilla type environment like we were in. It's not very good, I don't think, if you're uh, lining up 100 troops here and you've got 200 on the other side and you're making an assault. That's what Olsen was good at was uh, assassin. He was an assassin, really, and he would go out and sit by a trail and wait for somebody to come down the trail and kill him, and then he'd put uh, grenades under the body and says, "I get two more in the morning." I mean, that's in that kind of warfare. Believe me, is very effective in where we were working because once that happened, the enemy would back off because they wouldn't. They knew that they weren't just going to have free reign of coming and going. Even though at night they pretty much owned the place. With Olson around, they decided to back off. And I give him a lot of credit for we were operating on a river called the Mangtit River, which was it was a connecting canal slash river between the Basak and the Cochin, main branches of the Mekong. And uh, freight, bananas, fruit, whatever was going to Saigon would go up these canals on boats, motorized boats. And the Viet Cong would tax them. And because they can, and at night, they even in the daytime, they would tax them. It was like having a toll road. And they would use that money, of course, to buy weapons and to support the guerrilla activity in that area of the Mekong Delta. And that stopped on that river once we got in there and said, "Hey, we're going to protect this shipping." And our fighting there was mainly at night, but in the daytime we were all over that river, and like patrols would be in a patrol car in a city or something, and they didn't mess around with us much. We had one guy killed there uh, just when we first started on that canal, and then we had Olsen come in, and I don't know how many of the VC he killed at night by setting ambushes, but it was very effective. And I went on one sweep with him, and I didn't totally agree with the way he conducted himself. He was sort of a slather ass. He wore black pajamas. Wouldn't wear a uniform. He looks like the Viet Cong. He used an AK-47. He didn't trust the M16. And we went into a sweep down one side of a river. We went into a Buddhist temple, and it was a flurry, and he hosed the thing down, and it was a chicken. I don't think he even killed the chicken, but I said, Bob, could have been a kid in there. You can't do that. Listen, I shoot first and ask questions later. I mean, he'd been in Vietnam longer than me, and this is the way he fought war. But I still respected him because the results of what he did were obvious. I mean, the shipping began to move along that canal, and some of it was us on our boats, of course, but a lot of it was Olsen.
Now, did Olsen, he went out completely alone, or he would bring some Vietnamese with
He was
him?
all by himself. The Vietnamese Navy. No, I'm sorry, the Vietnamese Army, the ARVN. They had a boat division. And basically, they had taken a lot of the old French gunboats when the French were there, and they would move along the rivers of the Mekong Delta, that probably even before the Americans got there. They had these old French gunboats, and he would come down as an advisor to them. He'd live on those gunboats. He'd eat the Vietnamese food. He'd sleep in them, in hammocks and stuff, whatever these guys had. And so again, he was leading by example. He didn't ask him to do things he wasn't willing to do, but he was quite undisciplined. I mean, I think what killed him, Olson, is that he overloaded his boat going out on a patrol. He had a Boston whaler, and instead of having 6 guys in it, he had 12 guys in it or something like that. And he got swamped, and the boat went over or tipped or something, and he was a good swimmer, but he got hit in the head by one of these French gunboats coming behind him, and we found him in a fishing net the next morning. Two was he was a stocky guy for a Vietnamese. A little bit on the chubby side, I guess. He had a big round face and a big smile, and he spoke excellent English. And one night he took my boats out. It was unheard of because I was sick. I said, well, he can call the artillery in, he can do everything. And then, of course, the Navy found out about it. They, oh, you can't have that anymore. But two was that I had absolute confidence that two would stay in fight and slug it out. I mean, he would do what had to be done. And he believed deeply that a democratic South Vietnam was worth fighting for. Uh, he was disillusioned, of course, like most of the Vietnamese, because there was so much corruption in the South Vietnamese government. He was just a friendly guy with a smile. He was smart. and he was unflinching when it came to military matters, combat and stuff. He wasn't afraid. He knew he was what the risks were, and he wanted to learn. I mean, and he'd been on these heavier boats, like I say, the rag boats, or maybe even South Vietnamese had some of those old French gunboats. So he'd been on various types of boats, but the fast PBRs, pump-driven boats that we had, he had not been on, and they wanted him trained in it. The Vietnamese did, and these were the kind. And that, Tu wasn't the only officer that I trained, but he was the one that I became closest to.
And in your experience, though, he was unusual among the Vietnamese forces in that.
Well, I think he was an unusual guy. Although my experience with the Vietnamese that we trained and were on our boats is that they were on the side of what they were doing. I mean, they believed in democracy in South Vietnam, but that they were some of them were more disillusioned than others, I think, with what was going on with their own government. There was a hubbub going on in one of these little hamlets that had an outpost there, a militia outpost. And I said to the guy, "What's going on?" He, he went over and he came back. He said, "They're mad because they're going through the pay line twice and they have to send a second check, second cash up to Saigon. They didn't keep any of the second payroll. Of course, we're paying for everything, the Americans, right? But they're pissed off because the skim is too, is there, as far as they're concerned, is up in Saigon is too great. We're the guys doing the fighting down here. How come they're taking at least half of it? That's not right." So they're all mad about it. Well, it's all bakshish. It's all bad stuff. As a matter of fact, I wrote to Lee Hamilton, a congressman I knew, and I told him about this, and they had a Navy investigation. I jumped the chain of command, I suppose, by so doing, but it pissed me off too. They did an investigation, and the Army said, "Yeah, it's going on, but there's nothing we can do about it." I think the colonel that was around there got shifted or replaced. I felt sorry for him because he had nothing to do with it, really. U.S. Army colonel, but that was the kind of thing that I was demoralizing to me, and it had to be demoralizing to the Vietnamese. I mean, it's just there's no other way you can describe it.
So it sounds like, you're suggesting because, a lot of American vets say that they did not feel that they could rely on South Vietnamese forces. And it sounds like your perception is that, the fundamental problem was with government corruption. And
Yeah.
these forces are basically essentially asking themselves, why should we fight hard for a government that's so corrupt?
The only way I would requalify what you're saying is that two was in the regular South Vietnamese Navy, and the people we were training were basically out of Saigon, a part of the organized military. They were quite reliable, in my opinion. They would stand and fight and do everything else. Down in the Delta, these local militias, we called them rough puffs, regional forces. Our guys called them rough puffs. Well, they might get paid, they might not get paid. They're like weekend warriors. And when we went out on patrol to set up an ambush, and these guys were out and ahead of us, you might say, between us and Cambodia, we were never reliable. They were not reliable in terms of intercepting the enemy because they probably went to sleep and didn't want to fight. So we would move our boats away from them basically because
Hmm.
we thought that the rough puffs, some of them could have been even in collusion with the other side. Nobody knew.
Right.
And so if an American distrusted Vietnamese, it was these more, I'd say, volunteer militia type soldiers, but the ARVN, the regular Vietnamese army, and the regular Vietnamese Navy guys that I'd met, yeah, they've been trained to fight, and they did. He was an inquisitive guy, and I'm sort of that way. We'd sit in a beer barge and we'd talk history, or we'd talk politics, or argue. and one thing or another. And we also had a common background in that I'd been to seminary. I had gone to a Methodist seminary, almost became a minister, decided not to do so. And he had gone and he was headed towards the priesthood. And finally realized he met a girl that looked really good to him, and he said, "I can't have a relationship with her if I'm going to be going in the priesthood." And so he gave up the idea of the priesthood. So we talk theology. Uh, but Jim was a very engaging person. I mean, not everybody is inquisitive. Not everybody wants to talk about history. I mean, most Navy guys want to talk about girls and beer and the last hoorah. And that wasn't Ross. Ross was, we just got along on various levels. And so, and he was killed in a night attack. A B-40 rocket hit him right in the head. Boom, gone. And they were going on the Vente Canal, and they were going out actually to set up an ambush position. And Jim was the officer in charge of, I don't know, 5 or 6 boats heading out to set up these ambush positions. And they got hit on the way out. It was like shortly after sunset, and it wasn't in the middle of the night, as I recall, but um, it was, ooh, yeah, that was tough when because obviously he was gone.
How did the news about Lieutenant Ross get to you?
Um, we were in the wardroom playing bridge on the Mekong River after dinner. I played bridge to kill time, and we had a Vietnamese officer who was in training at the higher levels. He was I think, a commander or a four-stripe captain. He was up there, and he was a great bridge player. We were playing bridge in there, and all of a sudden, the word came in that there was a firefight on the canal, and there'd been a fatality. And then later that night, they flew Ross' body in, and I can see the helicopter coming out of the rainstorm. It was a bad night, rainy night, but the Navy helicopter pilots were all officers who'd been trained in uh, instrument flying, so they could fly in clouds and fog and bad weather and rain. And they came in and landed that night on the YRBM 20. And but it was one of those bizarre things. Here we are playing bridge, and all of a sudden, one of your buddies has been killed down on the canal. They took Jim Ross' body, and the Vietnamese wrapped it in a typical Vietnamese linen kind of uh, uh, clothing. And but he was wrapped like that, and there were prayers and incense and things like that going on with the Vietnamese at the base while his body was there, and then it was airlifted off in the morning. I was a senior to him because I was an officer. But in terms of these boats we were on, he was the guy. I mean, and I worked closely with him. And so when he was killed that night, he'd come in, the boat had come in all shot up to the base camp, and I was fixing up guys that were wounded and getting them out on helicopters and stuff. And Tozer died. And finally, we sent his body out on the last helicopter. But the boats still had to stay out. The rest of the boats that were under our command were still out at ambush positions. The Navy called them waterborne guard posts. You don't want to call them an ambush site, right? But
Mm,
that's what they were.
yeah.
And so I knew these guys were going to be really depressed and down because Tozer, I had to tell them when the boats came in that Tozer died. Me, I hadn't told him by radio that he died. And he came in. I said, I went to each boat, and they said, "Hey, the chief got killed last night, and all the other guys are wounded and out of here." And I said, "You just gotta try to distance yourself from it, run on electrical energy or whatever resources you have, because we're going out again tonight." you know.
Mm.
And they responded, and we went out again on patrol or on ambushes. Probably that we used to go down for like 3 or 4 nights and then go back to the supply ship for a couple nights and then go back down. That was the rotation. One of the reasons this is very personal to me, I was supposed to go where Tozer was that night. And Mike Conley, he said, Raleigh, the water's going down. The monsoons are over. The water in this canal is receding. We're not sure how much longer the rag boats, the heavier boats can be down in here. And sure enough, a week later, they pulled them out because they were scraping bottom and stuff. And but the PBRs, I mean, we had a shallower draft. We could get into these canals easier. And so he said it's possible that the UPBR guys are going to have to stay down here and run this operation. And you need to be in here tonight to see what happens if we have firefights. But the radio obligations are calling in the helos and taking care of all the stuff here at the base camp. So I stayed at the base camp that night. We called this area Blood Alley. It was such a lot of fighting happened there, and Tozer went out in my place. Well, I could have been Tozer. I mean, he was the next senior guy to me, and they wanted the most senior guy in this particular place because that's where they expected the most trouble. And so I'm the luck of the draw that I wasn't there really.
What's the story of what happened to Chief Tozer?
Well, the story, the B-40 rocket hit him in the leg, blew his leg off. And when the boat came in, he was still alive, and he was saying, "I help me," and he was saying, "My kids and my wife," stuff like that. And of course, his wife had already died, but I said there was only two uh, Americans. Well, there was some ragboat guys there, but I was the senior officer at the base camp that night, and there was a medic, a corpsman, a Navy corpsman, don't remember his name. And I said to him, I said, there were Vietnamese around, but I said to the corpsman, I said, you got to try to help the chief. He's the most seriously wounded, and he couldn't find the artery. It was, of course, we were dead flashlights. It's in the middle of the night. And well, I was working on the guys that could communicate with me, and there were a lot of shrapnel wounds and stuff like that. But it's interesting. All I had was survival school training and in PBR school, and but they told us about sucking chest wounds and about oozing wounds and about how to do it. And then we ended up having to cut bandages out of uniforms because we ran out of bandages, and tourniquet certain wounds, but put pressure on other wounds. I mean, and most all those guys survived really, except for Tozer. We got him out. They all were bleeding in one way or another. Some were worse than others. Uh, but
Hmm.
anyway, that's exactly how Tozer died. The B-40 hit him and then exploded through the boat, but it hit him directly.